and I could use yet another monitor. So one of the first things I want to do is, that's my presentation. I want to change over to I want to get out of full screen, and I want to change over to this view and see if these font sizes are readable for you guys. Can you guys see and read the code?
A little bit higher.
Yeah. Yep. Looks great to me. Thank you.
That's really big. And then I'm assuming then I'll need to go a little higher on font size in my.
Yeah, you always want the font size to feel uncomfortably big on a presentation.
Right. Is that readable for everybody? The terminal window is a little less important than the code, but
readable for me.
Just barely.
Just at the edge, yeah.
Okay.
Better.
Yeah, I heard a guideline somewhere that the font size should be the estimated oldest age of the person in your audience. I don't know how valid that is, but take it for what
pretty
it's
big. Pretty big with this crowd.
Yeah, we're getting up to 40s and 50 points there.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess Jess is recording. I'll dive right in. Some of you heard a little bit. There's going to be some live coding here. Wish me luck, because I should have taken Shane's advice. I did take Shane's advice. I just didn't give it enough respect in terms of how hard this is to do. So that's part of it. But first, just a little introduction. I'm going to talk today about Phoenix LiveView. And I'm sure some of you have had just about enough of me talking about how cool it is, banging on about that. Some of you probably know we've built some stuff in it, both for ourselves internally. PeoplePerf is written in Elixir using the Phoenix web framework. And we have also built stuff for Novo using it. That was, we were ready to put it into production, and they dropped the ball on. So I can say, John and I both, having had to step away from it at a couple points and work with other stuff, keep talking to each other about, oh, this is very cool. We miss, like, we wish we could go back to working on it. We wish we could do this project. So one of the, I mean, it is, I find it a uniquely powerful environment. And a big part of that is because it's functional programming. I really like that model. I suppose probably not everybody does. But I think the other kind of key point about Elixir and Phoenix is it makes hard things really easy. Things that would be kind of difficult to even think about, problems that would be difficult to think about solving in other environments, get relatively trivial. It's an amazing sort of ecosystem to work inside. And for that reason, I think a team that has a level of confidence with this tool can do things, better things faster than teams that can't. I really do think it could be a competitive advantage. It would allow us to deliver better things for clients on shorter timelines and smaller budgets. To demonstrate kind of why that, one of the things that I think makes it very cool, I want to talk about LiveView, which is kind of a new thing that they've added to the environment. And I'm going to, again, present here. And we will talk a little bit. I have a grand total of 2 slides, but we'll talk a little bit about how LiveView works. So Phoenix's web framework, it's a really important part of the Elixir ecosystem. Up until this point, its purpose has been to do what you would expect a framework to do: APIs and server-side renders, pages. Not that you see a ton of those anymore, but that's what it's been focused on. The team that wrote it kind of asked, well, you know, is it possible to get a responsive sort of web experience without actually having to write front-end code? Can we do that? And their answer was, yeah, we can. And they did it in a really clever way that kind of uses some unique features of Elixir and then also just some really clever code as far as I'm concerned. So if we're looking at the diagram here, hopefully all you guys are seeing the LiveView lifecycle slide, okay? This whole thing starts out the way you would expect it to, with an HTTP GET that's for a specific route. The Phoenix server renders that template that it finds on that route, and it returns it to the client just like you would expect with a regular old server-side rendered page. And that's important because you don't have to do anything funny to optimize for SEO, or if for some reason the client doesn't have JavaScript enabled or anything like that. You get a functional page. Then, if the route, the request is for a LiveView route, you annotate your routes, and we'll look at the file that controls that in a minute here. When it returns a response, Phoenix attaches a chunk of JavaScript, it's the client code. And what it does is when the page is actually finished loading, it opens up a WebSocket back to the Phoenix server. Phoenix server responds by launching a LiveView, spawning a LiveView process for every unique connected client. And that essentially holds the state of that rendered page at that point. So it's a bidirectional connection on the WebSocket, of course. And then when events are generated by the client code, so this little piece of JavaScript does a couple different things, one of which is it attaches a bunch of event handlers. When events are sent by the client code, the backend process handles those events. It re-renders the template server-side, and then it only sends diffs down the wire. And we'll look at that in a minute here. And then the other piece of the puzzle on the client side is it runs a little chunk of code called morph DOM that essentially just patches the DOM with these diffs that it gets back. So they're really compact. And so it's not that you don't have client code, we do. It's that you don't have to do anything to that client code. It's essentially just a standard little chunk of JavaScript that gets sent along by the environment. So, let's see here if I'm, yeah, I mean, it's conceptually relatively simple, but I want to actually show how it works. So we're going to dive into some actual coding here, which is going to be real interesting. So I'm hoping set my DB here real quick. And I apologize, my computer gets really slow when I'm presenting and I have all this stuff running. I'm making the environment look bad because it's actually quite fast, but my little laptop struggles. So I just started up the server here, and then we're gonna go ahead and look. And as I said, I couldn't start from absolute scratch in this case. But, come on, this thing's really slow. But nothing that's LiveView specific has been implemented yet. This is just a basic template at this point. I did create 2 database models, one for rooms and one for messages. And then there's some data access methods that I had to make a minor modification to one. I'm going to show you guys here. Elixir actually makes it really easy to create new contexts. And it will give you basic data access methods and everything like that. But we're not real focused on the database stuff today. So this is the page you're looking at right now. And as you can see, there's not actually a whole lot here yet, but for any live view, you have to have, to even render, you have to have two functions implemented. One is called mount, and that sets initial state on the backend process, the LiveView process. And the other one is called render, and that does something pretty obvious. One thing to note, this socket here is actually a pretty complex data structure that is the entire state for the WebSocket, and that includes anything that you assign. Like the state that you assign to the page all goes in that data structure. And so that gets passed around because it's functional programming. There's no objects, there's no persistent, it's all, you know, it's all return values essentially from functions that come back. I also wanted to briefly look at this router.ex file. When I was saying earlier how the Phoenix application server can route these things, and if it knows that it's a live route, it'll attach the code. This is how that works. I've added this line here, and it just says, hey, if you get a request for this route, you route it to this chat live module. Simple as that. So if we look over here in the browser, we've got a list of rooms that I've pre-populated a couple in there, and we have a new room form. But if we click on this, nothing happens. If we click those buttons, nothing happens. There's nothing working here yet. So, as I said, we've got mount and render. Those are the two things required to even just render the page. But we need to be able to handle an event that comes from the client, and there's a specific way to hook into Phoenix to get that to process the event. So I'm going to make a real simple change here. To correctly, and that looks right. I'm also going to change this. So it sends the room ID. So if I save that and pull up our console here, this thing does live reloading. Oh. Sorry. Wanted to change the button, not the label. Okay. So if I change that, this live reloads. Let's try adding a new one. And we get a bunch of red text. If you look at this, the key part here is it's saying, hey, you don't have this handle event function defined. And it essentially, at core dumps, the process dies, the individual LiveView process dies and actually reloads. So you don't lose, the client doesn't lose their connection to the page. You don't get a 404, but it doesn't do what we need it to do. We need to implement a handle event function for our view. And I'm just going to go in here. And I'm going to implement what I would refer to as a generic. This just takes 3 generic parameters. There's no pattern matching going on here, which is kind of an important / very cool feature of Elixir. But we have an implementation of that function. So let's try it again. We'll reload very slowly. Okay, and we can see in this case, it did just what the code said it was going to do. It literally just logged it to the console and said, hey, we got an event, type create room, and it had these parameters. So in order to actually handle this correctly, we need to write a handle event that's specific to that event type. And this is where the sort of pattern matching starts to come in. And you can see, for one thing, I had to put it before the catch-all one here. Elixir does evaluate these in order from top to bottom, and so it considers both of these the same function because they both take the same number of parameters. It uses the pattern matching to determine which one it's actually going to run. So in this case, we're saying, hey, if we get one that matches, the first parameter is this string, create room. We're going to extract, if it has a key name, create name in the map that it receives as a second parameter, we're going to extract that to a local value name, create name. And then the third parameter is the socket itself. And that is always the same. Handle event always has to have socket as the third argument. And so what I'm doing here, this chat.create room is literally, that's just a database access method that goes ahead and takes the parameter that we took here, inserts it in the database. I'm just matching on the return from that, that it's okay, and then it returns the actual object that was, or the row that was inserted. That's getting assigned to room. So the last step is handle event always has to return a tuple that starts with this no reply atom. And then we're using this assign, which is a helper function that you use to assign values to socket. We're passing it the existing socket values, and then we're setting a key named rooms, and we're taking the existing list of rooms, which had those two that are already there on it, and we're prepending the one that we just inserted into the database. So I'm going to save this. And I'm going to try this again. And that took way too long because my computer is running slow. If I didn't have the share session up, this is essentially instantaneous. There is no HTTP round trip. And I'm going to kind of show you guys how that works by opening browser tools up, develop tools in the browser. So I'm going to clear it. I'm going to do a reload. And then we're going to look at our WebSocket. You can see the network messages here. There's the initial round trip. And add another room. And we can see this was our outgoing message. And I don't know any way to change the font size on this. If anybody has any ideas, I know this is probably really hard for you guys to read.
I did just see that Zoom under the view options lets you pick a fixed zoom and then you can pan around.
View options in
Us as clients, we can look at, we can zoom in to 1-to-1.
Oh, okay.
Small.
Yeah.
So I mean, the actual specifics here, what we're seeing is it's sending a very tiny chunk of JSON that has an event type or an event name, a value, and then the type is form. And then real quickly, oh, that's the heartbeat. There is a heartbeat on this too. The response that comes back from the server, the diff itself, oh, come on, is really, if you drill down into it, it's really quite small. It's just a list of rooms and then the ID value that's assigned in the to the button, and that's it. So the page will re-render that without, again, no round trip needed. If you're not trying to run it on a tiny laptop while you're presenting, it's actually so quick that you really don't even notice. There's no perceptible lag on the client side. Okay, so that's really cool, but let's just make this work worse for my computer. What if there's somebody else connected to the lobby here, and we add another room? We see it right away, but they don't see it. And that doesn't work for a chat app or anything that has sort of shared, a need for people to see shared data. So Phoenix actually gives you some very cool tools, and the environment itself, Elixir, because each and every connected user has their own live view process. And Elixir has a very cool sort of inter-process communication model where each process has its own little incoming message queue. It's first in, first out, and it just processes them serially in order. It will not process the messages in parallel. So you don't have to worry about concurrency at that level. We're going to use that feature along with another built-in feature of Phoenix, which is that it has a built-in PubSub server that you can use that provides topics that can be subscribed to. We're going to do a couple of things here. The first thing we need to do is actually alias PubSub into our code so it's available to us. And then we're going to change our mount function. We're going to add a call to PubSub subscribe. This is just the name of the local PubSub server. You assign an atom to it when you start it up. And again, this is something I did behind the scenes. You do have to add one line of configuration to your project to configure this. And then we're just going to subscribe to a topic named Rooms. Rooms doesn't exist right now. The mere act of subscribing to it creates it if it doesn't exist, which is really nice. Makes it really easy to do. What will happen here is essentially every client that has this view open will subscribe. Their LiveView process will subscribe to this Rooms topic. And because they're subscribed to it, any messages published to that topic will just get delivered directly to their inter-process communication queues. So the second piece of this is in our handle event call for creating a room, we also want to broadcast that it now exists. Okay, we got to refresh there. And so what happens if we go ahead and try creating yet another room? Well, we see it here, and we eventually see it here, but if you look here, we got a similar message. You can see it got inserted into the database, of course. This one reloaded or didn't reload. This one refreshed right away. The page contents will change. We're getting a very similar error to the one we got before about the missing handle event. And we have, it's a very similar solution in that, oops. When LiveView handles communications between processes on the server, it's not a handle event call. It's for a function called handle info. And handle info only takes 2 arguments, but otherwise is very similar. And I've gone ahead and pasted in another generic here that just will log this. And so let's try this again. Okay, so it shows up here like we'd expect. It actually has not shown up over here because this page didn't crash and force a reload of the process this time. The LiveView process for the second browser on the left here actually got this message. And now we just need to create a specific version of handle info for that view that actually updates the list of rooms. And like the other one, we need to put it before the generic. This will reload eventually. Okay, so you can see they both reloaded because the code changed. And you can see they both updated right away. No round trip required. Now we've handled creating new rooms. It inserts into the database. We update any attached clients using PubSub. Next step is we need to be able to actually join a room. So I'm actually going to reset my database here again. And we will try to make it so we can join a room. Start the server. Notice, actually, can you guys see that there's a little spinner in the corner of the browser here? Because the server's down. Oh, is this still running? Oh my gosh. This usually takes about a second and a half to run. So apologies here. Okay. If you watch that little spinner, when we restart the server, the client will actually reconnect, which is pretty cool too. Eventually. I tried figuring out if there was a way that I could use another machine in my house to run the actual server itself. And because of the live reload of the code, so you guys will just have to bear with me on this. Okay, so it's back. So now we want to make it so when something happens, and right now nothing happens. In fact, yeah, you can see there's no unhandled event at the back end or anything like that. So we're going to do a couple things here. You guys saw that I already changed the button value to be the room ID. We're also going to add an attribute to this that looks very similar to the one we added to the form above called phx click. And this is essentially just, this is how the JavaScript on the client side captures the events. There's sort of standard named event types, and then it generates an event on that. Okay. So, really simple change. I'm gonna look at the console here. This reloaded. We're gonna try to join the argument room. And you can see it did generate an event. It was a handle info or sorry, a handle event, not a handle info. And these were the parameters it sent. So type join room, parameters value 2. It's because we have our generic written already. We don't have to, we get to see that. And that's why it's a really good idea, especially in live views, to have a generic written as a fall through case. So like we did for the create room handle event, we're going to implement a specific for the join room event type. Very similarly, we're just going to extract the value key to a local value called room ID. As usual, it takes a socket. We're going to return the no reply as required, and then we're going to use this Phoenix helper function. We're going to redirect the socket to this path of /room with a room ID, and we'll save that. So there is no route for /room with a room ID on the end currently. So we're also going to add that to the router. And of course, there is no room live module yet either. So we're going to go ahead and create one. This directory here, live, in the project, there's nothing magic about that directory name. It's literally just an organizational choice. There's no requirement to have your project laid out that way. So we're actually going to, top of this file is going to look very similar to the one we already have for the chat room listing. And we're going to start by just implementing what's necessary to render, which is the mount function. And paste in here. In this case, our mount actually cares about the first set of arguments, the params block. If you were to look mount up in the Phoenix documentation, it would refer to this first argument as params. And it was empty, or it would have been empty, and so we just ignored it for the mount for the chat rooms. But now that we're in a room, we actually want to extract this room ID from it. We don't care about anything that's happening in session. We're not using the session stuff. And again, as always, the socket is at the end here. We're doing a little bit of pattern matching here. This chat.getRoom is, again, a database access function that I didn't even have to write it. It got written for me by the database context. And I'm just pattern matching what comes back. This is the data structure type here. And I'm just extracting the name because I want the name of the room based on the ID. And then I'm also calling this get messages for room, which is another data access method, and assigning the result of that to messages. And I do want to look at this guy real quick so you guys know what it looks like. I'm going to have to scroll a bit here. This is just a very simple SQL query, essentially. And I'm just getting up to 10 messages, and they're sorted in reverse order from when they were created. So newest message is always on top, basically. So back to Room Live. And then down here, we're doing a little bit more than we did in the room listing. We are using the assign function 3 times to assign socket. We're going to assign a key name. Of course, we're going to assign the value of name. Key of room ID, same thing. We extracted it up here. And then we're going to assign to the key of messages this list of messages that came back.
Thatcher, what are those triangles?
Okay, so this is a little bit of VS Code and a little bit of Elixir. In Elixir, when you type the type operator and then an arrow like that, you can see my VS Code is turning that into a ligature. What that says is when you have a call like this, what I'm saying is, hey, I want to take socket, and I'm going to pass it as the first argument to this assign call. And then what comes out of this is a socket. Assign just returns a modified socket. And so we take that socket, and that gets passed as the first argument transparently to this assign call, which of course just returns another socket. And then finally, the same thing happens on the last line. So that's that pipe, the arrow pipe notation is kind of, because it's all about just modifying data structures, really, in functional programming. It's a really common pattern to see, and one that John and I both, I think, have found is really readable in terms of you're just taking a data structure and passing it through this chain of operations. So that's what that's doing, Phil. Is that
cool? Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so next piece is we have to write a render, and by write I mean cut and paste. And this does, again, a very similar thing. The assigns are just essentially the socket. It's a chunk of the socket called socket.assigns, and that's why we use this helper function here. And in render, because you're using this templating here, this /L quote, 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 that's the LiveView templating. The sigil indicates that. You can do these in line. I have for this project. You can also do them as a separate file. If your templates were more complicated, obviously you'd want to do that. So any key that was in assigns is now accessible with this at notation. So at name is just socket.assigns.name. You can see that right here. And render always gets called after mount, and render always gets called after any event or any info. It's always going to get called on the server side and then diffs return. So here we're just using this really simple templating language. This is kind of very similar to something you do in like PHP or ASP. We're looping over the messages, extracting a message, and then just printing it. So I'm going to save this. And then we're going to try to join a room. Well, first I'm going to create a room. And I'm going to join it. And there we go. It exists. There's no messages. So that's not going to work. We want people to be able to put messages in. So I'm going to add a bit to this template. And we're again going to do this phx submit. So it's going to generate an event. We've got an input type of text. We've given a name, new message, and then a submit button. So I'm going to save this. And there we go. And I'm also, at this point, just going to go ahead and paste in our generic event so we can see the event that this generates without causing the LiveView process to die. So save it again. Wait for it to reload. Okay. And of course, no change to the view itself, but you can see we did receive an event here. And so this is going to look very similar to the one we already did for the chat room. Put it above the generic. And this is pretty straightforward. Sorry about the scrolling side to side here. We're just saying, hey, if the event type is create message, we're extracting the parameter value for the key new message into new message locally, and again, the socket as usual. And we're making, again, a call to the database access module. We're passing in a couple of parameters, and we're capturing the return. Okay, we're assuming it's okay. This is not what this code would look like in production. This would be a case statement that checked to see if it was okay, and if it didn't, did something else. So we get the message back, just the one that was inserted, and we do the same thing we did before. We come back with a no reply, and then we assign to the socket to the messages key the same messages that were there with the new one prepended, and that's it. So save that. This will eventually reload. And there we go. It's there. Now, you guys won't be surprised to see that if this user joins, they see the first message, but they will not see the second. And so this problem gets solved the exact same way we solved it for the chat list. On the mount function, we're going to use PubSub again. This time we're going to subscribe to a topic named room, and then the room ID. So any user that's looking at that view for that room is going to subscribe to that topic. We're also going to add a very similar block to the handle event for create message that we did. This will be very similar to the one we did in the chat room or in the listing. We're just going to broadcast this new message. That's going to be the message type. And then finally, you guys will probably remember this needs a handle info instead of a handle event. And I'm going to go ahead and put in one that's specific for new message, but I'm also going to put in the generic because it's just a good thing to have there. We'll save that. these guys will both reload. Let's see what happens. Test one from here, and it works. I had originally, there is a presence module in Phoenix that I actually wrote some code so we could replace these dummies with people's actual usernames. And as they left and joined these rooms, you would see them appear and disappear from a list. And we can actually even, in here, I even added I think it was, yeah, right here. I even had this set up to do a PHX change where we could indicate next to somebody's username that they were typing. The presence module essentially tracks users based on who's subscribed to a topic. And then you can assign sort of configurable metadata, like whether they're typing or not, to that. And then you can just sort of modify that data structure with handle infos and handle events. So on a PHX change, handle event start typing, we would change the presence of that user to say that they were typing, and then we would change their status. Sadly, I knew that I was going to run out of time, and I did want to leave some time for people to then actually ask me some questions and discuss what you guys think. Sort of my theory that, again, that being able to write a responsive web application without necessarily needing to start a front-end repo, I think is something that really expands the sort of capability you could offer to a client, especially on a really short timeline. The other neat thing about this is, like any sort of best practice for anything that's a web project that uses MVC, is you put your business logic in your models. And I kind of showed you guys my model, my model functions, which is just some very simple data access methods. If you were to start a project and you were to use LiveView, you're not straitjacketed into it at that point either. As you do more and more interesting things with the data, which is typically where the business logic goes, you could easily turn around and use those access methods to create an API endpoint in the same project if that was necessary. Obviously, if somebody needed an API right out the gate, you wouldn't bother with LiveView. But you could build something that was sophisticated and looked really neat. Now, I guess I'll show you guys one of the projects that comes with LiveView is what they call Live Dashboard here. And there is no front-end JavaScript for this aside from the little chunk that comes along with LiveView automatically. This is all done server-side rendered. And you can refresh it, or it refreshes when things change. Obviously, there's not a lot going on with the graphs, but you can see all the sub-applications that were started. You can see the processes that we're running. So I wanted to leave 10 minutes for discussion. That's about what we've got.
So a couple of times you showed us the server-side crashing, which I know is the Erlang thing, right? Is what to let it fail.
Right.
How do you lose any state? I noticed that reloads the client side, but does the client side lose all of its state? How does that work?
So one reason you see it reload on this screen is because I'm running it locally. So there are certain events that will cause it to push a reload to the page. The key thing with that is, yes, you can lose state because any state that's in the process but hasn't been saved as something persistent can go away. So the key thing there is you would, want to not have, the 2 times you saw that crash, both times it was because of an unhandled event, essentially. And that's why those fall through cases are really important. Because you don't want to have it's like any programming language, you don't want an unhandled exception. But the key thing is that your mount is written in such a way where they get state back as they need to. You know, because that mount only gets called the first time somebody loads the page. As long as that WebSocket is up and active and the server doesn't die, and by the server, I mean the specific LiveView process attached to that client, then that mount doesn't get called again. You can force it to call. There's a helper function inside Phoenix. If you really want somebody to mount again for a reason, you can. But the default lifecycle, there's no mount after that. So the key thing is to make sure that your state gets anything that you want to persist, get saved. And that's why we call the database update first, and then we do the PubSub publish. Because if the database dies, we don't want, you know, or if there's some problem with the database call, we don't want it to.
Yeah, I guess I was mostly curious about, there's often some amount of client-side state, right? Like a view state, like stuff that it's relevant to the session, but not, you wouldn't want it to just disappear and reload your page, like what columns you have turned on, where your sort order is, or those sort of things.
Right, right. So one, yeah, you definitely have to be aware of that in terms of making sure that things that do get saved. There is, I mean, again, in the interest of time, I didn't dig into the Phoenix session module, which John and I have used, and I'm going to sound like I'm, you know, a broken record here. It makes it super easy to persist user preferences. Kind of pre-built a lot of it for you. You just kind of have to decide how you want to do authentication, and then.
But I presume that would basically then store that session information in the database.
Right. And here in Mount, where we're currently just ignoring this incoming, when you prepend a variable name with an underscore in Elixir, what you're saying is, hey, I know that this is coming in. I want to identify to myself that this is session, but I'm never going to use it. And so that's why that's there. If there was something in session that we wanted to extract from this, like a map of user preferences, it was coming from the session module, which would be upstream of LiveView, then we could totally get those. So as long as your session has a way to persist, even if the LiveView process dies, your session is persisted in the main server.
What happens client-side if the LiveView process dies and the socket goes away? How does that
that's when you see the little, let's go back.
little flittering thing?
Sorry, this actually should have known. I would have thought they would have opened that in a new tab, but you would see, I'll show you here. You see a little spinner come up. It will try to reconnect it's got a timeout value. But then if I restart the server, the backend process will have to call mount again. And so to your question about, you do have to be careful with, I mean, it's like anything. If you have stuff that's on the client side that's unsynchronized to the back end, you will lose it if something breaks. So you do.
You still have to think a bit about how you're going to manage your state, even though it's all in one process.
Right.
But that makes sense.
So when this thing eventually restarts, I knew this was going to be slow with the presentation on. It's like 10 times slower than it is.
Erlang is incredibly fast.
Yeah, it's kind of famous for like sub-millisecond response times. So this nonsense here is just because I have too much running. It's very fast. And actually, the responsiveness of the backend itself has been pretty good even after, even with that. You know, if I type in another message here, yeah, it took a second, but it does come through when I refresh. So.
I'm curious, Thatcher, have you read or seen anything about the adoption of this? Is it being used by a bunch of people? I know Discord basically does something kind of like this, and they use Elixir. Are they using it?
Yeah, a lot of people are using LiveView. My suspicion is, I mean, I know that there are products that are already built on top of it. And again, this is not a 100% like, oh, you should always use LiveView. I think of it as kind of a very cool, like sort of 80-20 tool, where you can get 80% of what you get if you wrote an API, wrote a single page web app for about 20% of your effort. You can get something that looks cool, that has sophisticated capabilities, that's responsive to user input without requiring you to do that. The other sort of thing I would toss in there is, and I didn't get a chance to dive into it, and because I'm a troglodyte when it comes to front end stuff anyway. I mean, John knows I'm somebody who learned to write HTML when we were still using tables for layout control. They have put a lot of effort into what they call JavaScript interop, where you can have your own custom components that you deliver to the browser, but those components use LiveView and the WebSocket to get data back and forth without having to make HTTP round trips to an API endpoint. You still handle it. You're still handling that all through the standard mechanism of LiveView. I would be interested to see what somebody who knows enough about that to actually form an opinion thought of that by looking at it. But again, I think it's a really neat way to sort of have a lot of capability up front without closing the door to doing other things at some point down the road. And that, you know, John, I think you and I have talked about this a fair amount. I didn't even look at the fact that this framework automatically creates tests for you. I mean, obviously you have to write your own, but much like it automatically created data access methods for me, it creates a testing framework. Elixir, I think, it encourages really high quality code and quickly. So,
well, one of the things I really like is that I think it can't be underscored how much more maintainable a code base can be if there's one instead of two, right? And if all your code is running in one process, so you can debug everything that's happening in one place. I think that's huge.
You know, I think the automatic assumption with a lot of projects now that, oh, well, you know, we're immediately going to have to build an API, and then we're going to have to build, you know, a React front end or what have you. And again, Ray, don't take this personally. There's not enough of you to go around on every project, and not every project needs it. I mean, there's plenty of things that have a lot of client-side processing. I mean, Google Maps, you're not going to re-implement Google Maps with LiveView. You know, where the only solution is to build sophisticated client-side code in JavaScript. But there's a lot of things where that's overkill.
Yeah, I'm really
especially
curious.
overkill for MVP.
I'm really curious about when you're needing to initialize like another library, right? You have a component that's getting all your data from this server, but then let's say you need to implement some sort of interactive graphing library, and then as the user engages with it, you know, we need to pull more data in, and then the diff is going to change, which then means does the graph have to re-init, or like when you're doing more complicated components rather than just sort of display and submit sort of things, how far down this road can we go before we need to make that switch?
Right, and I think kind of figuring out where that would be an important part of, you know, adopting it would be kind of figuring out where the boundary of where it's reasonable to use is.
Well, I think that, I mean, in principle, it's just a latency issue. I could actually imagine, without probably not too much code, we can make React run exactly like this. We can make a React app that ran 100% server-side with the same pattern. And it's just a question of the round-trip latency and what that ends up looking like. So like if you're doing a drawing program, that would be crappy, right? Because you'd be trying to drag a drawing arrow, and you have round-trip latency, that wouldn't be good. So most other things don't need sub-100 millisecond latency.
They don't. And for what it's worth, the guy who wrote Phoenix, who then wrote LiveView, he's kind of ridiculously smart. His name is Chris McCord. He does a little talk on LiveView where he introduced it. And what he has said on a couple different occasions is they've honestly been surprised by just how far you can push it in terms of latency. Like, it doesn't introduce a lot of latency. There's a demo project that you can download. It's basically Pac-Man rendered server side, and it works pretty good, believe it or not. Like, there's quite a lot you can do with this. The latency is low enough that you can get away with it. Even server rendered sort of animations, I've run mine up to 60 frames a second, and it works, believe it or not. So,
well, that makes sense, because that's essentially video streaming, right? You're essentially doing low bandwidth video streaming. So,
and it's built on top again of the Erlang VM, which, you know, one difference between that and sort of like trying to do this on the back end with React is you need to launch a bunch of different node processes as you're loading up to do this. it's probably not reasonable in a node environment to have one process per connected user. That would kill a machine if you try to do that for more than a few users.
Well, Node could handle many, but not as much as Erlang.
Right. This, I mean, you know, again, Erlang, it's like, oh, you want 1 million processes? Whatever. Like, I don't care. It can handle it. So,
I'm also really curious about the ecosystem on the build side, right? So one of the things that is really nice on a lot of the front-end frameworks is to be able to change the appearance, not just layout or what is rendered, but the actual like styles of a component based on context. Right?
Okay.
So I'm really curious if that is a possibility in this sort of system.
that's an interesting question. Again, front end, I know very little. I do know, as you can see here, the watcher that watches the Elixir code also will run Webpack if you change your front end code. You know, so it compiles to this app.js. It compiles this and then sends a bundle out.
Yeah, it would end up needing to be a lot more specific than that, because it's going to be like a per instance of per component sort of a level of detail. Right, so imagine like these messages you're passing back and forth, you know, based on some flag that you send as part of the reply, you know, whether it's important or not, or something to that effect. It changes the style to italics or the color or something.
I'm sure you could do that by getting those and put conditions into your templates, you know, because that would change classes and
right. Yeah, the classes definitely would be an option. I'm just curious if the more kind of CSS and JS sort of approach is possible. But.
Right.
Hey guys, I have to jump off for a candidate interview, so I'm going to stop recording. Okay. Thank you so much, Thatcher.
Thanks, everybody.
Thatcher. Bye.